A few years after the Space Mesa event, John attended a talk with about a dozen people on another Friday night. After it was over, Frank said, "Let's go outside, and maybe we'll see a ship." The group knew that Frank often was able to call in an ET ship, so, once outside, everyone looked up, eagerly scanning the skies. Before long, somebody pointed to an object in the air with red and green flashing lights and excitedly asked, "Is that one?" A few people groaned out loud. They could all hear the engines of a small plane. They went back to searching the sky, and after about 5 minutes, Frank pointed to a tiny white light. It was smaller than the planet Venus, and it was crossing rapidly above us from east to west. The white dot gradually got smaller by about half, as if it were increasing in altitude. Frank said, "That's a ship. I often see them on Friday nights." He explained that some ETs were returning to their home bases, mostly on Mars and Venus. They had just finished a 5-day work week on Earth, mainly in the military and defense industries. They were leaving and would return to Earth on Sunday night. Tom found that funny and joked, "So after working 9 to 5, even ETs get Saturday night fever." The group laughed, and Tom added, "John Travolta may be practicing disco moves on that ship right now." Pete said, "All joking aside, it looks like a satellite to me." Tom countered, "I've seen satellites, and that one's moving far too fast." Frank continued, "Satellites don't go higher and get smaller. And they don't orbit in tandem, and these Friday night ships usually travel 2 at a time. There should be another one any second now." When the first one disappeared, another white light showed up in the eastern sky at the same starting point. And it was following the same track as the first. Frank looked over at John and said, "Why don't you time it?" John quickly held up his watch to catch the light from the window and glanced back and forth at the second hand as he traced the light's path across the sky with his finger. After it disappeared behind the mountain, he said it took about 8 seconds. Frank suggested, "You can use that to estimate the speed. I think you'll find that those lights were moving a lot faster than any satellite." Fred was still skeptical and asked, "Why do they travel to another planet just for the weekend?" Frank replied, "Well, they have family there. Also, for some, Earth's chaos and negativity are hard to take. They need a break. And, of course, not all of them leave. Only a few." Ellen asked, "Why don't they just teleport home?" Frank said, "They usually do, but I asked them to show themselves tonight. And they did, so all of you could see them." A little bit later, Frank reminded John to try calculating their speed, and so John went outside alone and stood in the same spot where he had stood earlier. The lights had appeared behind a tree and disappeared behind a mountain. So John held up his arms to the sky at about a 90 degrees angle along the path of the lights. He guessed that the track of the ships was about 80 degrees. That meant the ships had taken nearly 8 seconds to move across 80 degrees of the sky. After some research at home, John found that most satellites orbit about 160 miles up or 260 kilometers, traveling at velocities of about 17,000 miles an hour or 27,400 kilometers per hour. A little math showed that if those lights were flying at the same altitude as satellites, their speed was an astounding 120,000 miles per hour, equaling 193,000 kilometers per hour. That's more than 7 times faster than any known satellite or missile. But, what about airliners, John thought? Plenty of them flew across that area, going back and forth from the east coast to west coast. After checking, he found that the cruising altitude for most of them is about 6 miles high or 9.6 kilometers, and they travel at about 600 miles per hour or 970 kilometers per hour. Using the same math, he calculated that if those two objects were 6 miles high, they traveled at more than 4,500 miles per hour or 7,200 kilometers per hour. That's more than twice as fast as the world's fastest known plane at that time, the SR-71 Blackbird. So it was not a high-flying airliner or military plane. Next, John thought, what about small private planes flying at maybe 10,000 feet or about 3,000 meters? He quickly realized that it didn't fit either. A private airplane would have been low enough for them to see the red and green navigation lights, and because it was a quiet night, they would have heard the engines. So the two lights were not small planes. To sum it up, John knew of nothing on Earth that could move that fast. Of course, that doesn't prove they were ET ships. But John thought, if not ET, what else could they be? He had no answer. Strange as it seems, the best solution was what Frank had said. They were two ET ships traveling together and leaving Earth.